On Tuesday, October 29, 2013, I began conducting my research. My goal was to find out if production value in documentary films impacts perceived credibility amongst viewers. In other words, do viewers think that documentaries that are well produced are more reliable than those that are not? I chose a clip from Werner Herzog's Encounters at the End of the World to show the first group, which was a classroom of students at the University of South Carolina Upstate. I considered this the high production value clip. Afterwards, I administered a survey to the participants. On the next day, I showed a different classroom a clip from the same university. It was the same clip from Herzog's Encounters at the End of the World, but it was an alternate version that I had edited to make it seem like a low production value documentary. I reduced the audio quality, the image quality, and added artificial camera shake amongst other factors to make this clip seem inferior to the other in terms of production value. After showing a second different classroom this clip, I gave them the same survey. As it turns out, the low production value group thought of their clip as more reliable than the high production value group did. To dig deeper, I interviewed some experts about production value in documentary films and the reliability of documentaries or the lack thereof.
It's really hard to tell on first glance which documentaries are more reliable than others. Typically, if a documentary tends to focus more on say interviews with other subjects as opposed to just straightforward narration, then I would say that it would at that point appear to be more reliable, because instead of getting the narration, which you know for a fact, or at least you're pretty sure is the voice of the filmmakers, the people producing the body of work, instead you get interviews with a variety of different people.
So in terms of its entertainment, it needs to tell that story in an entertaining fashion. If, however, we're going to engage that documentary as a serious record of events, enter it into the historical record, then its credibility becomes crucial. The degree to which we can determine that that documentary is recording facts accurately, is not leaving out crucial information, is not offering an overly or overtly skewed perspective, these issues become very important.
If I'm going to read a newspaper article or magazine article or something, I have to trust that the author went out and actually got the sources that they say they have, or has obtained the information the way that they claim they did. In a documentary film, we're able to, if it's done correctly, we're able to actually see that.
One of the big indicators for me of the reliability of a documentary is interviews with experts. And this is true for a lot of investigations, but when you see specifically that a person who knows what they're talking about has been called in to comment, that indicates a little bit of reliability. That tells me that the filmmaker has taken some measures to ask the right people. I don't think of documentaries as unreliable. I think of them as more or less biased. Most documentaries are video essays, and when they're upfront about being opinionated essays, they're reliable, even if it's just a reliable opinion. When I see an opinionated portrayal of a subject portrayed as truth, and the documentarian is not present in presenting it as their own argument, then I guess you could say that I find it less reliable, especially if there's a big sign at the end that says funded by the Institute for whatever.
The obvious disadvantage to documentary as opposed to other forms of media like books or academic articles is just the cost. It sometimes costs more, and it also takes up more time if you're going to make a documentary than if you're just going to write. And plus, you'll need more people involved typically, somebody to shoot if you want to make sure the editing is good, that sort of thing. Then it's going to take a lot more time and effort to make a documentary. One of the advantages of documentary as opposed to traditional print media is that in documentary, you have the opportunity to appeal to people who are more visual learners as opposed to someone who learns best when they're sitting in a classroom and taking down notes. So if you have, on one hand, see a article that someone is reading, then they may process the information at first, but forget about it more readily than they would if they were visuals that sort of supplement whatever the central argument is.
And most documentaries that folks see is actually video that they're seeing on television, History Channel, any number of cable niche markets. And folks engage those documentaries daily and far more often than folks read, say, for example, journal articles. Now, if we're talking about academic audiences, then that's a different issue entirely. But in terms of popular audiences, the appreciation for and engagement with documentary comes from ease of access in terms of cable distribution and the familiarity, engaging video, TV, instead of, say, going to the library. The only real competition in terms of engaging documentaries of events would be news media, but that always focuses, of course, on the present. And so if anybody's engaging in a sort of more remote past, then they're going to be doing so most often via documentary video on television.
Documentary films, some people would say, are easier or maybe less reliable because of the fact that you can edit a film to say what you want it to say, to convey the message that you want to convey. That argument is slightly flawed because the author of a newspaper article or book could just as easily make up sources or lie, and then the information that you're reading is likely to be unreliable. Overall, I think documentary films are just as reliable when done right, and that's for the viewer to judge. But if there's fact, there's sources throughout the film to back up the points that are being made in the film, it's certainly a more interesting medium, in my opinion, than a book or a magazine. It's something that I enjoy. I enjoy watching documentary films. I find some are reliable, some aren't reliable. That's for me to decide, and I'm presented with what the director has given me, and then I'll decide if that information is accurate and if I'm satisfied with the sources that were given to me.
I think the biggest advantage that documentary films have over print documents and articles and journals is the visual element. That's obviously the biggest difference between those two mediums. So I think that the fact that you can and are encouraged to display primary documents or graphic assistance to the narrative on a documentary is very helpful. There's also the element of potential entertainment value in a documentary, and I don't mean to say that that's an advantage. That's both an advantage and a disadvantage, because a lot of times the entertainment aspect of a documentary can overwhelm the informational value of it.
Documentaries may be more interesting to some consumers than traditional print media, but is there a correlation between production value, perceived credibility, and entertainment factor? In my study, the low production value group rated their documentary clip as more reliable than the high production value group participants rated their clip. The high production value group, however, seemed to be less bored than the low production value group while viewing the clip. Neither group rated their respective clips as anything higher than somewhat entertaining. 28% for the low production value group rated their clip somewhat entertaining, and 26% for the high production value group. The high production value group, however, had less people rate their clip as somewhat boring or very boring than the low production value group. When the participants were asked if they would be interested in watching the entire film of the clip that they had watched, 26% of the high production value group said that they would, as opposed to the low production value group's 11%. Also fascinating, the high production value group would also be more likely to recommend this documentary to a friend than the low production value group. This data certainly raises some interesting questions.
If the filmmaker didn't spend the time on those production values, it makes me question if they spent the time on their sources.
The experts also point out that many viewers have a different standard of production value of other forms of media than they do for documentary films.
Production value in documentary, I think, is very strange because in a way it's almost the opposite of in fictional films. Because in a fictional film, if the production value is very high, if there are millions of dollars being spent on it, an individual film, big stars, great special effects, then it seems more likely that people will flock to the theaters and see it as opposed to a small-scale, low-budget independent film. With documentary, however, the more polished the particular film is, the more certain people are likely to think that it's being slanted in some way because they realize that this means that there's big money behind each of the documentary projects, and because of that, there's some opinion possibly from the producers which is getting filtered through. So the documentarians can't just say whatever they want. They have investors and everyone else to think about. However, if you have a low production value documentary, or even just one that's made on a much lower budget, then you don't have those external factors. You instead have a sort of central thesis provided by the filmmakers, backed up by their various sources, and at least hopefully there's less external influence that's sort of interfering with that opinion.
The clip that I selected from Herzog's documentary did not contain archival footage. The experts, however, have touched on this subject in their interviews.
Footage from World War II is going to look and feel different than contemporary footage given the materials available in each particular era. As such, the scratchy newsreel footage of the early 1940s from the war in the Pacific has a greater, in a sense, credibility and authenticity than contemporary recreations that would have a higher production value. So I would suggest that production value and its quality is going to vary historically with regard to the degree to which it seems to speak to or from the authenticity of that footage.
As a person who makes films and videos, the production value to me is an indicator of how experienced the filmmaker is. It's also an indicator of how much they have access to in terms of resources. Money used to be a big thing. If you see high production value, that meant that somebody has a lot of money. And them having a lot of money may sway whether or not you think that that documentary has some credibility. Maybe the fact that they have a lot of money makes you think they don't. Maybe if you see a low budget documentary, you think it's more real.
If there's an HD, slickly packaged, well lit, well articulated sequence of footage wherein the featured performer, host, expert is accustomed to, say, video work and doesn't constantly glance away from the lens, well, then those aspects of production value are going to suggest a degree of preparation, engagement, financing that certainly are going to give that work some credibility. However, if it's a documentary about World War II or about late 19th century any particular historical event, if it never includes any documentation, then it's not going to be assessed as credible necessarily. If it's only telling a story, say, about the late 19th century, never incorporates any late 19th century artifacts, then for audiences with any interest, again, in authenticity, which I think is the sine qua non of documentary validity, then that documentary is not going to be as persuasive. So I think that any good documentarian knows that the incorporation of archival materials and, when available, footage and photographs are crucial in suggesting to the audience that it's a credible, authentic documentary of some particular historical event.
If you're going to, walk up to the CEO's office, it's understandable that you're not going to have a lav mic attached to the CEO when he gets there, or everything is going to be more raw. You're probably using shotgun mics. You're probably using booms, stuff like that to get your sound, and that's okay. People understand that. A newscast, if the anchor was holding onto a stick mic, you're probably not going to be very impressed with that newscast. And in sports, sound is just as important. Everything in news and sports, you want crisp. You want to sound real good, and you really don't have to worry about that so much in documentary. And you have to be careful, with that. You don't want the film to look messy necessarily. You don't want it to look like they were careless. But I think the raw, it all goes back to the rawness of the film.
I think the production value of a documentary may be indicated by who that documentary is able to get access to in terms of interviews, where that documentary is able to travel to get B-roll, what sort of documents or archival media is that documentary able to integrate to indicate a higher production value, and how cleanly is it edited. Some of those things overlap with Hollywood films. What actors are you able to get access to for the performance is an indicator of production value, for example, and how clean is it edited is also an indicator of production value. The stylistic differences between the two really stand out, but there's a lot of blurring of the lines between those two because the Hollywood or traditional narrative film industry and the documentary film industry both kind of go back and forth at mimicking each other for certain narrative purposes.
With documentaries, there's almost an expectation that the production value is going to be lower than it is in other forms of media. For example, when people watch sports on television, they expect a certain amount of glamour. They don't expect to see the same setup for football now that you saw in, say, the 70s, where it's mostly just an overhead shot. You expect to see different perspectives, to cut to the announcer and then to cut back to the field. The same with television programs and of course with fictional films. And even the news, where you have on one hand a talking head that's sort of spitting information out at you. You've got other news that's sort of in the bottom of the screen scrolling along, and a number of other different types of information that are assaulting you all at the same time. The main emphasis there is on flash, so it has to do with keeping you away from boredom as opposed to actually informing you about any particular topic. Documentary, if it's a very effective documentary, can be entertaining, but also the central issue should be informing the audience instead of just entertaining them.
Well, I think that in some ways that's a false distinction being drawn between, on one hand, documentary and on the other hand, other forms of media. We could see this perhaps most immediately in well, for example, the news. So the television news is effectively a extended, ongoing documentary of the present. If for a more specific example, we might turn to sports news. ESPN is a channel dedicated to 24-hour sports programming on television, and they've sponsored a highly successful series of documentaries that initially began as 30 for 30, and yet NFL Films has regularly featured documentaries of football and has looked to the archival footage and packaged it and deployed it in a variety of networks. So I don't think it's easy to draw a distinction between, on one hand, conventional television programming and on the other hand, documentary.
The process of shooting is extremely important in the perception the audience has of the topic given. Buster Keaton once said that tragedy is a close-up and comedy is a long shot. The way that you frame something is extremely important to how it's perceived. If somebody gets punched in the face from far away, we laugh at it. If they get punched in the face right in front of us, we get nervous. The same is true in documentary films. How far away is the person shooting? Do they decide to include everyone present in the frame? No matter where you point your camera, there's 1,000+ different ways that you're not pointing your camera. The music that you add to a scene can completely alter the way that scene is perceived. So if we show an ocean and we use a nice piece of classical music, we get a peaceful, serene scene of the ocean. If we play the theme from Jaws, we are ready for bloodshed.
Every aspect of filming, and this is true with fiction and documentary, involves a number of conscious decisions by the filmmakers which are designed to have a specific effect on the audience. So the same way that in a fiction film a low angle shot or a high angle shot will have completely different effects, those techniques can also be used in documentary.
In selecting which artifacts, video, photographs are going to be included, in the tone of voice and the specific language of any voiceover, in the introduction of any text, this is all going to dictate aspects of how the audience, how at least the producers, broadly speaking, of the documentary intend their audiences to receive it.
When you see films, documentaries that are edited, and clean cut, I guess you could say, they just can't be completely objective to me, because I'm looking at something that somebody spent a good deal of time correcting. And when you're making corrections, it's very easy to, as a filmmaker, to want to correct maybe something somebody said or the way they said it, probably like you'll do with this film.
As long as humans are making documentaries and humans are making films and humans are writing, as long as humans are involved, there is no objectivity. I don't think there's any chance for objectivity, and if we make the robots that make them, then there's probably no objectivity there. I think it's our obligation, ethically, as filmmakers, to present as many sides of the story as possible.
Documentary is never objective. No story is ever objective. No telling of history is ever objective. That once we point a camera at something, that by definition we are not pointing a camera at many other things, or if we develop some horrible machine with an array of cameras whose field of view was such that you had a sphere with a camera at every point, so that you were pointing a camera in every possible direction, except of course inside the sphere. So we kept the sphere, this imagined inverted panopticon, if you like, to be, say, 10 feet across, and you were not, and of course I suppose you could then illuminate the interior of the sphere and have a set of other cameras pointing inside the sphere, meaning that everything in this field of vision would be recorded. Then of course we would need to select which of this footage is going to be available. Unless, of course, you make all of it available, but then the sequence in which you make it available, or if you display it, I suppose, in a room, now imagine that we have the sort of inverse of this spherical recording device. We have a theater that is 400 feet across and a sphere, and those projections are illuminated on all the screens comprising that sphere, and that the spectator would stand here. Well then, in this case, the audience would be dictating the content of the documentary, because the audience could not look in all directions at once. Their glance would be shifting over this 360, three-dimensional landscape, reproducing some event that was recorded. So you can never see the whole picture. You can never see the totality of history.
I don't think objectivity is really possible in a documentary film, primarily because every time they decide to shoot a subject from one direction instead of the other, every time they decide to cut up a particular interview, say, and use one part instead of another part of it, then that's a decision that's a subjective choice by the filmmakers.
If we were making a documentary film on a product and it was the first time that the filmmaker was using that product, we're seeing the actual first time. We can make our own judgments and our own conclusions from that, which makes it a better choice than that media at that time. So I think it definitely has a better chance at being more credible, and I think it often is more credible.
I don't think documentary can be more credible necessarily than other forms of media like books, articles, and everything that you would traditionally see as a source in a essay or in an academic publication. But I feel like documentary can be just as credible as any of the other sources, primarily if the documentary is made by a credible filmmaker, if the expert testimonials are real, so in other words, you have people who actually know what they're talking about and have established their know-how in the field, giving information, and also if you have a convincing argument which is conveyed not only through narration but also through the choice of images. Because of that, I feel that the best documentaries make for good sources, just like the best books and articles make for good sources. There are good and bad, true and falsified books and articles and documentaries. So once students or academics can decide which are good and which have more faulty information, then the actual medium itself is much less important.
I think that documentary films may have the potential to be perceived by the audience as more credible than other forms of media, but whether any form of media is more or less credible than the other is all based on perception.
Well, certainly, documentaries have the potential and indeed the necessity of being more credible sources. That said, they're not as popular. Bottom line is, right now, more people in the United States, especially those under, say, 50, their sense of what World War II was comes largely from fictional films by Steven Spielberg, as opposed to from the historical documentary record.
Credibility in documentaries can be improved in the future by indicating the sources that the information comes from. By presenting multiple sides of an issue, your audience is probably more likely to take what you say seriously. If you present all of one side of the issue, only the most hardened, opinionated people are going to listen to that media and think that it's reliable in any capacity.
News, documentary, recognize that they have an existing audience for their political commentary, their political history, and respond accordingly. Bill O'Reilly gives his audience what they want, and MSNBC gives its audience what they want. And that's a matter of market share. So documentarians need to be, in effect, forced to provide more contrastive, less reassuring views. History's not so simple, and that's just going to require audiences demanding it.
Steps that can be taken to make documentaries more credible are making sure that as a filmmaker they cover all of their bases. We see the sources. I don't, if they're going to present something, a fact or something, I want to see where they got that fact, whether that's through a video, an animation, something. I want to see that.
Video can certainly constitute a valuable and effective means of adding to the evidentiary record. However, as a means of constructing scholarly argument itself, I think that documentary footage remains, at best, evidence and occasionally argument, but should not necessarily in any meaningful way supplant, I think, what I just find the more effective and efficient means of organizing, deploying argumentation, which is print.
Yeah, there are a number of different steps that can be taken to ensure the credibility of documentaries. One of the primary ways to ensure credibility in documentaries is to set up a certain peer-reviewed system through which people who make documentaries work with academics who know a lot about their field, and then once the documentary is completed, then it's screened before it's put out to the general public by a number of other experts in the field so that any falsified information can be corrected.
I think a peer review system for documentary films would be excellent. I think if other documentary filmmakers could view each other's work and deem it credible, it only makes it makes it easier to look at those films and think, okay, what I'm watching, it's been agreed upon that this is a credible film.
So you've got folks who agree and disagree with it. So a documentary in healthcare, who's going to conduct the assessment of that documentary as to whether or not it is credible? It's going to be conducted in part based on the degree to which it matches the worldviews of those conducting the assessment. As such, I don't see that as a valid mechanism.
If a professor who wants to develop a book wants to add an additional element to this, then that professor could speak with someone who knows about shooting film and also make a documentary as not necessarily a replacement of, but a supplement to the academic text that he or she is writing. If we were to have academics who were to do this with their publications, not all the time, but on some occasions, then we could slowly begin to build a database of reliable information and therefore have a visual supplement to many of the academic proposals and arguments that already at this point exist in print form.
I think it's awesome that there is a system in place for written documents where peer revision and approval and databasing and archiving, everything is in place. It would be fantastic to have the same done for documentaries, to go into a documentary and instead of having it tagged as political documentary or satirical documentary, it's tagged with actual reviews and opinions and things. Lessening the steps between the user and and that information would be good. But at the same time, everyone should thoroughly research any piece of text or any documentary that they're going to perceive as truth and apply to their own lives.